Thank you so much, and good evening, and welcome to this session where we are going to find out what happens when the headlines become the story and how the headlines become the story. So, there's an Elvis Costello song where a lyric goes, Yesterday's news is tomorrow's fish and chip wrapper. So before these writers kill me, I hasten to add that it doesn't apply to them because all three of them have written very compelling books based on yesterday's news and today's news. Uh, so the other thing I found in common between the three of your works when I was going through it was that all of you have a very personal connection with the stories that you write about. So I'll start with you, Nina. You have written about the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi. And for those of us who remember that time, that was a defining moment. We all remember where we were, what we were doing, and when the news broke, and the aftermath of the assassination, watching the funeral on television, and then the manhunt for the assassins. So it's mind boggling to me to know that you were literally at the scene of the crime. You were the last journalist to interview him, and you were meters away when he was assassinated. So take us through that last fateful evening. I can only imagine what your feelings were at that time. So do tell us about that experience.
Yeah, well, I tried to, forget it and erase it for many, many years. And then when I came back to India, I was asked by the publisher why I didn't ever write a book on it.
Yeah.
And I told him, I said, it's the one thing I wanted to forget. But I think I could never ever get away from it because I was always after that seen as the last person to have interviewed Rajiv Gandhi, and I actually watched him sort of die in front of my eyes. Yeah, and the sad thing about all of it is that when he met me in Gindi airport, I mean, there was a sea of reporters in front of us. I mean, everybody was there to cover it, and he called me. He picked me out and said, "I haven't forgotten. We'll do the interview tonight." And he was that kind of a guy. He was very warm. He was not like the politicians of today who basically try to manipulate you or give you the story that you must run. I mean, he accepted the fact that we would critique him, and I mean, he got a lot of flack for. He came to Dubai, and that's when I met him for the first time, or the second time actually, when we were very critical of his policy of bringing down one government or trying to sort of be that kind of person who could sit outside government and yet control what was happening in parliament and all of that. And he didn't take it to heart at all, and so he was a very warm person. So I bonded with him. It was only 45 minutes of that interview, and then to have him, to see him sort of explode right in front of us was I mean, it's always given me the shivers.
And the last 45 minutes was actually in his car in the convoy going towards Sri Perumbudur.
Yeah, that was
Yeah.
quite strange because
Yeah.
there was a whole long convoy, and then as the cars were slowing down at all these intersections where there were lots of people, I could see one guy popping his head into the cars in front, and I was wondering what is this guy doing. And then he popped his head into my car and he said, "Nina Gopal?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "Come with me." So I left my camera, my handbag, my cash, and everything in my car, and I followed him, and I went into Rajiv's car where they had Margatam Chandrasekhar, who he called auntie, who was the MP of the area, and that's why he had come actually to campaign for her. And then there was another lady, I think it was her daughter, and there was one more person. So I was basically wedged, in the little bump on that the seat. I was literally like almost cheek to jowl with Rajiv Gandhi, and he was wearing a Gucci watch, so that Gucci watch kept going into my face every time he waved and stuff like that. But it was a very interesting interview because the question about his assassination, because he had no security at all. There was nobody there. There was just one guard who was in another car, like 30 cars down, and his window was down. There was a flash light which was aimed at his face so that the people could see him. And I asked him this because the first time I had seen a former prime minister who had absolutely no security. And as you know, famously, VP Singh, who no one actually questioned ever for doing it, scrapped his Z security when he became prime minister. So literally people were pinching his cheeks, reaching out to him in that through the window. And so this is the interesting bit. I actually asked him this question. I said, don't you think your life is in danger? I mean, how is it that you're, without any security at all? And he said, and I said, aren't you afraid of being bumped off? And he said, have you noticed how every single South Asian leader of any import has been bumped off, including, he called his mother Mrs. Gandhi, Sheikh Mujib, General Zia, and Bandra Naike. So, I mean, he actually named the people, and then, 20 minutes later, the man himself had gone.
Yeah. And somehow in the middle of all that, I can only imagine what your feelings were. As a journalist, it must have been a defining moment for you. But as a human being, to watch such a tragedy unfold before your eyes, but somehow you managed to get back to Chennai and file your copy.
I got into trouble for that because the SIT afterwards kept on bugging me and saying, why did you take Rajiv Gandhi's car? Actually, I didn't take Rajiv Gandhi's car. What happened basically is that in that huge melee, I couldn't find my car. And I mean, there were dead bodies and body parts, and I was wearing a white sari. I never wear white, and there was all kinds of stuff on me, and it was literally, I mean, it was like walking through people were crying, and they were all coming towards me because I wanted to go and see what had happened to Rajiv. So I was going through the crowd to get to that point, 10 feet away, and there were people coming at me, pushing, shoving, etc. And in that mess and melee, the driver who was Rajiv's driver, he found me and he said, you have to go now because there'll be riots. I said, they'll need the car to take the body. He said, my car cannot take a body. And luckily, I think somebody had called an ambulance. You see, nowadays at every election rally that you go to, an ambulance is de rigueur. Everybody knows it's there. There was nothing like that in 1991. There were no such protocols. And anyway, so he took me back to Chennai. Right. And I still remember filing the copy was very odd because I was in the Central Telegraph office on Mount Road. And as I started writing, I suddenly found all these guys behind me. Normally in the CTO offices in India at that time, they would be asleep, right. And these guys kept, "Hi Chamma, night Chamma," all of those characters. So it was quite interesting, that they learned it from me.
Right. Coming to you, Amandeep. Amandeep, you are Punjabi by descent, but you have never lived in Punjab, as far as I know. But you refer to it as the hole in your heart. And in your writing too, you keep returning to Punjab. So in your novel, Roll of Honor, it is set against the backdrop of the separatist movement for Khalistan. And of course, this labor of love, this non-fiction work that you have completed recently. You traveled in Punjab for many years, and you call it a part memoir and part history and part state of affairs about Punjab. So tell us about this strong connection you feel to Punjab, and why are you driven to return to Punjab time and again in your writings?
But thank you, Nina. I had never heard the first-hand account of Rajiv's death. So just listening very carefully to you. Well, what happens when the headline is the story? A mishap like me happens. That's what happens. I have carried two traumas in my heart right from my childhood. One is personal, one is public. The personal is mental health, and I wrote my first book about my mother's being diagnosed as schizophrenic. And the second is the events of the year 1984. I was 13 years old then. Separated from my parents, hadn't heard from them for 7 weeks when the anti-Sikh pogrom happens. I heard about the attack on Darbar Sahib on BBC radio. Satish Jacob and Mark Tully were the only ones reporting it.
Sorry, when you say separated from your parents?
I was in a boarding school actually in Punjab. I studied 83 to 90 in Punjab. Okay. Yeah. My parents were in Rourkela. I know this, the local ADM. I met him later when my second book came out and went to Bhubaneswar to launch it. A gentleman came up to me and said, "Are you from Rourkela?" I said, "Yeah." It's about 84. I said, "Yeah." He said, "I was the ADM." And it was great that Aurobindo Sahib, Behra Sahib, he actually immediately evacuated all the Sikh families to the Gurdwaras, so But my story has a further spin to it because my mother was not mentally sound. Inside the Gurdwara, my mother was the greatest Indira Gandhi fan. So here there is a mob ringing the Gurdwara to get to these 1,000 odd families. And inside the Gurdwara, my mother is saying Indira Gandhi Jindabad. So she is the target of these 1,000 families, so it's like my frail little father standing in between that. So these are traumas, um, uh, and I have lived hoping to, in some ways, find a time in this country's history when Punjab is seen differently from how it has been shaped since the early 80s. The public imagination of Punjab, of course, the granary of the country, but also all these other things, militancy and drugs and all these narratives that keep built.
Yeah, you call it the political narratives of.
Not only political, they are also, I'm very sorry to say, but it's a sense of demonizing of Punjab, right? And I have sort of swam against the grain all the time, against the water tide, to try to correct how Punjab is understood. So this book that I wrote, this Punjab Journeys Through Fault Lines, was actually an attempt to go and understand beyond the headlines, what are the real people like? And it is a hole in my heart. It is the texture of my blood because I was born in Rourkela, Odisha. I had smelt Punjab, I had tasted Punjab, I had touched Punjab, but because my mother was not well, I had not heard Punjab.
Okay.
So I was trying to hear Punjab through doing this book. So yeah, it's a longer answer, but I think this.
Yeah, we'll come back to that.
Yes.
So coming to you, Nirmala, you too have written 2 novels, which the underlying themes are also make the news often. One is about child labor, the other is about sex trafficking. And at the same time, you have a personal connection with these stories. So tell us a little bit about that.
So actually some years ago when I was working with the Times of India, my friend Catherine, who was working with this NGO called Development Focus, asked me whether I could go to Odisha and help them document some of that work because they wanted to raise funds. It was a program called Earn While You Learn with children in the tribal areas. And that's how I first landed up in Odisha. And it changed my life forever. So. And I was in rural Odisha, rural Jharkhand, mostly the Naxal intense regions, where NGOs were working with with several tribal communities. And I learned then how no political party had ever set foot in any of these regions. Most people were half my size, so there's nothing to talk about. And the children, and in the hotel where I was staying in, I overheard people wanting to trade some of those children, 3-year-old and 5-year-olds. They were rice traders who had come across the border from Vijayawada, and they were talking about such things. So, and at the same time, there was also the sense of hopefulness because so many NGOs, these, like Development Focus, I feel a lot of development in the country has happened thanks to, in these regions at least, thanks to some of these NGOs. And how these children were coming up, and there was this little girl who, the day we had gone to meet her, she didn't turn up in the local school. There was this Bal Panchayat, and we waited and waited for about 3 hours, and then they said, let's walk down the road. It's anyway a tiny village with just about 10 hutments. So we walked to the edge and wandered inside, and then there was this little speck of pink I saw, and then I realized that, and then suddenly a little kid burst into tears. And I learned, she was so smart. She was dressed in a pink salwar kameez, short hair, and looked so, and she was a star there. She used to rear ducks. But that day, her mother had left her for another man, and her father had died long ago. Her brother wasn't around, and this child was all by herself. But then within 2-3 hours, she started warming up to us and talking to us, and the entire tribal community was taking care of the child because they knew what had happened. Okay. So that was how this whole, so many things changed for me. I just said I cannot work with page 3 anymore. I cannot, I don't relate to the city anymore. There were so many things that were like kind of, and I had grown up believing, why do you need reservations? But then when you look at all this, I said, my gosh, it's absolutely essential. And another, God knows how many years, we can go on like this for another 100 years and nothing's ever going to change. And then, so that's how Hunger's Daughters was born. And a few years later, I went to visit my friend Catherine, who heads this NGO called Freedom Firm in Ooty. And I had just gone to visit her, but then I met some of the inmates there, and they were young girls who were about 24, 25, many of them HIV positive, and they were survivors of sex trafficking. They had been trafficked by their own families, relatives, people, who they had known well, and they were there making jewelry, fashion jewelry, trying to make a living. Some of them had children, some of them didn't. And a few months later, I also went to Calcutta because I became so intrigued with the project, and I was writing about it for one of the portals, Vikalp Sangam. And then I met this one girl called Shoyantika, who told me how her own brother-in-law had trafficked her when she was just 8 years old. And she was in this brothel, dark and dingy place. And there was this guy pimp who was telling her, she must see her first customer. And she was petrified. And there was an older woman who was in her 40s who said, I'll take care of you. And that guy got wind of it and stabbed that woman to death in front of this child. So these are the traumas. And then, of course, this child was trafficked. I mean, she had several customers, was in the trade for several years until she was 15 or 16, when she was rescued from a hotel in a small town in West.
So this is what inspired Taboo.
Taboo. Yeah.
So I actually read Taboo, and given the theme, I was expecting this very somber, bleak read. And I was pleasantly surprised to find that it was actually this kind of whimsical, lyrical, satirical novel, which often brought a smile to my face. And it's also very experimental in form and in the manner of storytelling. So how do you go from the grim realities of your work and the stories you encounter to this thing of lyrical beauty and satire?
So the reason I wrote these books was because I'm a very hopeful person, and I'm also very optimistic. And when I was first writing Hunger's Daughters, and then later, immediately after that, Taboo, I was writing to a young audience, communicative English students from Mount Carmel College who were reading the book every day, were reading what I was writing every day because I wanted feedback. And then I was watching them respond to what was there and what was being said, and and the kind of nuances that were brought in, and how you could, the whole idea of writing fiction is to move away from the reality and create those alternate realities. And to me, all these women, although I had seen so much bleakness in their lives, all these women, all these little children, these women I'd met were total winners.
Right.
They were so optimistic. Look at that little girl who 2 hours after her mom had left her was talking to a total stranger, to me, about her business, her duck rearing business, and how Shoyantika had come out. She was the manager of that whole workshop. She was getting married to the love of her life. There was so much joy and so much coming out of all that darkness.
And I think that reflects in your work, the joy and the buoyancy, it reflects in your work, I think.
Yeah, and I also identify with that. I think I'm that kind of a person.
That kind of
too.
person,
Yeah.
okay. So as we know, wherever there are headlines, controversies cannot be far away. So just staying with you, Nirmala, for the moment, things like child labor and trafficking are so common that we have all become very inured to it. And even when they make the news, it's like buried in some inner pages and we skim over it. But there are certain headline grabbing events that you have actually referred to in your book. And there are certain characters that you have portrayed who are familiar to us from the current political landscape. So tell us about that, how, your treatment of
that. So actually, when I write, I go with the flow. So I'm actually reading the news every day, and I just go put on the music, and I don't know what's coming next. I have the larger picture, but I'm just swimming with the.
And you write in Koshis, I heard.
And I write in Koshis. So I'm just having a good time looking at everything else. But for instance, when the demonetization happened, I was traveling to, I had finished writing Taboo, but then there were several edits and then it was sitting with a publisher or whatever. And then I went to Odisha again, this time not for that. I finished writing Hunger's Daughters. Hunger's Daughters was almost out already by then. And I noticed that some of these tribals were standing there. It was announced that people, there were ATMs, mobile ATMs all over the place. And we went to this very deep tribal community somewhere in the Balangir district. And they were all standing there with 500 rupee notes, not knowing what to do with them, looking hungry as hell, nobody to help them.
So you felt you needed to portray it in
It just came when I was like sort of expressing.
Yeah. So your book is actually a sort of a satire on the politics and society of India, not just on trafficking.
Because they're all intermeshed. You
Yes, they're all.
Figure there's some political nexus involved, some business people involved.
Right.
It's all.
Yeah.
And it's
just for the
such a vile nation is what I
exactly.
When you're talking like this, I feel sick to my stomach thinking that is this what we are?
Exactly, yeah. And all these miners, they're eating up tribal lands.
Yeah.
And those farmers are struggling. So it's all, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting so marginalized, and everybody's hand in glove. We know how. The powers that we are all hand in glove. And to me, I cannot discriminate between any political party. I did not see anything happening. I said, this is the state of most of our nation, which no one ever steps in.
So you just wanted to reflect that in your novel.
Yeah.
So Amandeep, coming to you, you are no stranger to writing about politically sensitive topics. I saw some Goodreads reviews of your book, Roll of Honor, which actually criticized you personally because you portrayed a protagonist who was sympathetic to the Khalistan
That's
cause.
a troll. That's a troll.
Yeah,
guys.
okay.
These guys have been after
All right.
me now.
I'm sure there are many of those.
Over the last few
I see.
years,
Okay.
I have seen how that particular guy, I think Ganesh something.
I saw that. Yeah, I thought it was strange actually.
Yeah,
but then we
when the
always
book
get
came
this.
out, he was like, "Oh, wah paji, wah likhti kitab." And then when I started speaking against the BJP, he's like, he went to a public site like this. I just recently, The Wire interviewed me over the recent farmer strikes, and the troll factory has produced me as a Khalistan supporter. I'm like, you go and read my book. That's the first
I think
cogent
people don't
argument
even-
against
exactly.
Khalistan. So it's like,
So even in your in Journeys Through Fault Lines, you have been quite blunt about all that ails Punjab, and I believe you have been critical about many things, and including institutions and religious organizations. And I think your translator had something interesting to say to you about that. So talk to us about how you approach subjects which are in the public memory, which are politically fraught, which people have strong opinions about. How do you not mince any words? And what is the kind of reactions you have got from not only readers, but publishers? And are they kind of reticent to handle topics like this?
No, for that record, I mean, when the third book, the Punjab, we had finished editing. I found a wonderful editor, a Tamil Brahmin actually, Malayali Tamil Brahmin, who has lived in Punjab for 10 years and run a school there. So he reads and writes Punjabi, so Karthik Venkatesh. And we worked together for about a year, finishing the book. He removed 80,000 words from it. It is still 550 pages. It's a pretty big book.
That's another book in itself.
Yeah. But then he suddenly said that Kartika VK, my senior from university, as well as my publisher, she read the book and then she said it has to go to legal. Because if there is something coming up, we need to be aware that this could come up, and then we decide whether to cut something. I said, I'm not going to cut anything. If you don't want to publish, fine, but I can't cut. Actually, Regal reviewed it over 2 months. I went off to the US. I said, I can't sit here doing this, And I came back and Karthik said, Legal has approved it completely the way it is. Because I know what I have done.
Right.
I have put my ears and eyes to the ground and I have documented people's stories. And tell me in the last 50 years, if anybody had done anything good to Punjab, it would not have been in the mess it is right now. So if it is a mess, then everybody is responsible. including political parties, religious institutions, people politics, all that is responsible for where we have reached. So you have to tell it the way it is. See, I see my job in Punjab as, we know there are sicknesses, there are illnesses that have happened here. But my job is as a doctor to diagnose what has happened.
Right.
I'm not treating Punjab, I'm only diagnosing it. You can't be wrong in your diagnosis.
Do you feel we've sort of lost the art of the debate and nuance, and we can't disagree anymore in a civil manner?
I
In a
have
public.
disagreed, and everybody has loved the book in Punjab, but that's what my translator said. Coming back to that point, the guy who is translating it into Punjabi, he said, Paji, Angrezi is fine, there's a different class of people who read. But if you are doing it in Punjabi, then I will need to get armed guard for myself. I said, well, we'll see, but I think,
But I did see that it was received,
Yeah,
especially
it
by
has been.
Punjabis.
And more importantly,
Yeah.
within Punjab, there is left, which has been at one time, very important, even now the farmer protests are actually left oriented, this is what I was saying in the Wire interview, and these guys so it can't be Khalistan. Then there is another community, which is the far right Sikhs, who still hold on to the idea of Khalistan. And then there is the Hindu population, which is so important. The whole story has become about the Sikhs, but there is a Hindu population. They have a story too, All three groups, you've done many readings, all three groups have said, yes, you got it right. Because if I am not playing partisan politics, they recognize it, they respect you for it.
Right.
So when you have an agenda, that's when people take you on. When you have no agenda except to say, boss, we goofed up, we need to mend ourselves, then it becomes a different thing.
That's great to know, actually. So coming to you, Nina, there are a lot of conspiracy theories floating around about Rajiv Gandhi's assassination. And you have highlighted certain things like the security lapses and failures of intelligence before the assassination. And after the assassination, kind of indifferent attempts at investigations, botched arrest attempts of key players. So instead of getting them alive, they actually swallowed cyanide pills and died. And finally, the failure to extradite Prabhakaran and his close associates and bring them to book in India. So given all these omissions and oversights, they look a little suspicious. So what credence do you give to various various conspiracy theories? And specifically to two things, I would say, was there an Indian hand in the assassination? And secondly, was there a massive cover-up by successive governments as to the nexus between the Indian state and various Tamil separatist groups like the LTT?
Yeah, I mean, if his copy got edited or not edited, the entire chapter of mine didn't appear in my book. This is where I actually addressed some of these stories. Because one of Rajiv Gandhi's security guards who traveled with him to when he went to meet Olaf Palme, told me something which was very unsettling. He said they sanitized the whole room that Rajiv Gandhi was supposed to stay in that night. And then yet, when they went back in the night, they found a rifle on the window ledge. So the connection to Olaf Palme, who was also assassinated very strangely as he's walking with his wife to go for a movie on the streets, and Bofors it's always intrigued me. I said, it started with Bofors. And and that whole Ottavio Kotrochi and Winchada. In fact, the Winchada story is interesting because I was the one who exposed him. I was a reporter in Dubai at that time, and we didn't even have mobile phones. We had beepers. So my beeper kept going off that day, and I finally called that number back, and this guy rang me. He was basically a friend of mine, and he said, "You know who's in this building?" I said, "Who?" He said, "Aja, main batata hu, dikhata hu." So I went to the Hyatt Galleria, which is where, this man was apparently staying on the 26th floor. and my source was actually the lift fellow there. So the main manager wouldn't let me in. He was an Indian guy. He knew me very well. He said, "You're not going anywhere there." So I went through the skating rink, got the lift, went up to the 26th floor, and the lift man kept stopping the lift so that nobody would know he was going directly up to the 26th floor. So we stopped at many floors. And on the 26th floor, there was no sign, nothing. So he said, "Okay, I'll tell you where you go and wait there. He'll definitely come." So hours later, out comes Vinchadda, lumbering huge man. And so I ran up to him, and my photographer was taking pictures, and I said, "So you're Vinchadda, right? You're the Bofors man." He had a huge briefcase in his hand. He took it and he thalped me, and he said, "मैं आपको टुकड़े टुकड़े कर दूंगा, you know, मर जाएगी, मरवाऊंगा," all kinds of threats like this. So I mean, exposing that itself was something. They got really mad with me for saying it, but the Bofors thing, I don't think has been adequately addressed. But the SIT also, they did a fantastic job. There's no question. I mean, they tracked down everybody. And yes, in Shivaresham's case in Bangalore, I forgot the place's name, just outside Bangalore. The point there was, I think they waited too long. They knew they were there.
A day, I think, almost, right?
Yeah. And the Shivaresham himself knew that they were gathering around, because it wasn't a very crowded area, and they were being watched. So I think yes, they did. I think the SIT took too long, because by the time they got clearance from Hyderabad to send in the.
So did they just mess up, or
I
was
think
there
they messed up. I don't think it was a cover-up. I think they messed up, but you'd never know in India, anything is possible. But you see, the other story, which is also interesting, is that the Sri Lankan government itself wanted to put the blame on the LTT, because all the information that was given to the SIT came from Premadasa, who was himself assassinated by Prabhakaran a couple of months later. But it was Premadasa who gave them the details of who Sivareshan was, that he came from Udipidi, that it was his nieces, Shubha and Dhanu, who were the ones who were trained, and taken the Black Tigresses, that they were called, and trained for this job. And all of that was given to them by Premadasa. But I think it's basically because Premadasa and Jayawardena tricked Rajiv Gandhi. Because I think Rajiv Gandhi was very, he wanted to do exactly the opposite of what his mother had done. Because Indira Gandhi is the one who trained them, who's, she had all these training camps and so on and so forth, armed them and so on and so forth. So
the LTT was actually armed by India.
Yes.
And nurtured by India.
Yeah, not just the LTT, all of the various
during Indira
groups.
Gandhi's
Yes.
time. Right?
That was the way governments operated then. That was the power they had over other smaller groups, especially if they wanted to trouble. And she didn't like Jayawardena. She was a friend of Sirimava Bandaranaike, Indira Gandhi. And so she basically, but it was realpolitik, as opposed to Rajiv Gandhi, who may have wanted to win a Nobel Prize or whatever, he overturned every single thing that his mother did.
Right.
I mean, the Sikh God, the Assam Accords, and then of course Sri Lanka, where very foolishly we committed 87,000 troops to go and do Jayawardena's job.
Right. The IPKF.
The IPKF, we should never have sent troops to another country. And the problem basically was, we were supposed to go and what the IPKF's main job was to defang the LTT and give the Tamils a homeland, but not a state, not a country. And that was something that Prabhakaran was never going to accept.
Right.
He was not going to accept first the division of the north and the east. Not going to accept that he would never get Ilangay Elam. And that, I think, was why Jayawardena brought in the IPKF to sort of, like I said, to defang the LTT and also fight his own battle. He wanted the Sri Lankan army out of the north, because he was having this JVP, the Janta Vimukta Peramana, was creating trouble for him in the south. So he wanted his army to tackle that and our army to tackle the Tamils. So on both those counts, I think we made a big error. But the point I want to get to on the conspiracy is that, in blaming the LTT, we pinned it on the LTT. But, so many things that happened before that, when Pakistan was completely rattled. Nobody connects the dots. But if you look at General Zia was involved in the Afghan war, and in the when Operation, I forgot what that operation was called. I'm sorry, but when General Sundarji moved all those troops in sorry, it wasn't Blue Star is the Sikh one. Yeah. No, this was when he moved all the troops.
Brass
without-
tacks.
Huh?
Brass tacks.
Brass tacks, that's it. Operation Brass Tack. He moved every single man, blah blah, etc., to the western border, and Zia realized that there was no way he could go ahead unless he made peace with India. And he arrived in Jaipur for that cricket match, the famous cricket match, where he actually met Rajiv Gandhi face to face. And apparently, what I was told by other people who were in on that conversation is that he said they talked about a kind of back channel, and the back channel did happen with the ISI chief Hamid Gul and our RANW chief, and they met many times apparently in Vienna and Paris and wherever else, Dubai, I don't know where. And they started a back channel for peace, and then what happens? Zia gets bumped off, and a couple of years later, they somebody, whoever it is, bumps off Rajiv Gandhi, and just a couple of days ago, it's very strange, when you brought up this conspiracy thing, I saw this. There was a group called the Eeny Meeny Services, which was based out of the east of Sri Lanka, which was training the LTT and all of these people, the Sri Lankan army, on how to tackle these people. And now there's going to be an investigation into what this Eeny Meeny group was actually doing. And to a lot of people say in India, people who were involved in this say that the Israelis and the CIA at that point, Mossad and CIA at that point, saw India as the enemy, and did not want a strong leader in India who would be like Indira Gandhi, and they didn't want Rajiv to grow into that role. And if there was peace between India and Pakistan, they would have nothing to mess it. So you don't know. I mean, these are theories and conspiracy
And there may
theories.
be more to it than meets the eye, right?
I don't know what there could be.
We don't know.
We don't know what there could be. But it was very easy to blame the enemy because they were the perpetrators. They actually executed the job. But at whose behest, whether they were manipulated into doing it, you can never tell.
So actually, all three of y'all have so many stories, and I think one session is not enough. I have so many questions that I need to ask you, but I wonder if we have any audience questions coming in. Anybody has any questions? I think we still have a little time. 5 minutes, okay.
I think about 5 minutes to wrap.
Okay, so I will just, if you all can just answer as quickly as possible. I just have some last questions. To you, Amandeep, I know you're quite active and vocal about your support for the farmers' protests. Do you have anything to say about it?
Yeah, I think last few years in the country's politics, when we have inverted a secular democratic nation into a majoritarian nation, very democratically, and is bothersome for all of us. And there has been a propaganda machinery which is curtailing most discussions, debates, and at the same time, the constitution is being inverted. Whether it was Kashmir or it is the labor laws or it is right now the farmers' protest, And personally, I have been waiting for a time when Punjab can, in some ways, show that we will not tolerate nonsense. So, and this protest that is going on right now is actually a pan-India protest. Tamil Nadu is supporting Karnataka, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Rajasthan, Western Uttar Pradesh. And of course, what we love about it is three things. One is all these ideologies we talked about earlier, they've all come together in Punjab. They're on one front. The greatest thing is Haryana and Punjab are together. The last 50 years of that part of the country has been because of the division between Haryana. And the third great thing is that women are participating in so much big numbers. And what are they really demanding? They're demanding that a subject of the state list, the center cannot arbitrate on it, right? That you cannot take point 33 from the concurrent list, which is about trade of farm produce, and define entirely new laws for the entire agrarian sector. You know,
But are those laws valid if they are taken from a state subject and made into a central subject?
you can't.
So then
The Constitution
the
doesn't
three laws
allow-
are basically,
They are redundant actually,
Yeah.
but the Supreme Court will never say it because we just had a CGI who was made into a Rajya Sabha member. So see, the system is wholly being hollowed out, And here the guys who have been actually feeding the country for the last 50, 60 years, they are standing up and saying, okay, enough. Don't do this, And the government is also first time in 7 years it is shivering because actually this is its core vote bank.
Yes.
Exactly.
So that is my reason to, and I think going back to our email exchange, what would I change about Punjab? I would
Yes.
change the way it is represented. It's not like NY Times just put a story, say angry farmers
Right.
choke capital. That is not the story. There is a subtext to it which should be the story.
Okay, thanks for that. To you, Neena, I have an interesting question. Since you know Rajiv Gandhi, what do you make of Rahul Gandhi as a politician and future PM? You called Rajiv Gandhi politically naive.
Obama said it, don't you think?
Yeah, I said it all.
I think he has some way to go.
Yeah.
And I think if he had actually worked with the Manmohan Singh government and actually been a minister and given that kind of responsibility, maybe it would have been good for him. But yes, he does seem, rather immature but then maybe it's the generation. I don't know whether it's because, he was homeschooled and whether he wasn't, didn't actually have to interact with people. Because, when we're all scrambling to get into the bus and get to college on time and all of those things, it makes you who you are. I think you have to have a job. Rajiv Gandhi had a job. He had an income. He knew, how to run a household.
Yes.
And I think those are the things which make you understand what the travails of being a human being or running a family or any of those things. I think all of those things are learning curves.
And we should stop calling Rahul Gandhi a young politician, right?
He's not.
He's
He's
not.
yeah.
Yeah.
Not young anymore.
His, Rajiv Gandhi was PM at 40, I think,
44.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
So Nirmala, last question to you. I know you're working on a third novel. Tell us about it.
I can't say
Oh, you can't
anything
say.
very much, but it is again women-centric. And
Is it also based on news stories?
Yes,
Yes,
based
okay.
on and news just plays a certain
Part
part
of
in the
it.
story, but my stories are more out of my own personal experiences and what I've experienced in the rural sector.
Okay.
Because
I
I'm a
also had
social
one more
sector.
question to you, actually, that for somebody writing
Yeah.
fiction based on news stories, what would be your top tip?
Okay. One is you must feel very, very, very strongly for the subject. And then it should become such an internal part of you where, you are able to escape within and without and come up with that story. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. It'll
Thank-
look plugged.
Thank you so much to all the panelists.